Hello everyone, my name is Susanna Zuzel. I work as a policy officer at REVOLVE. Today we are here with MEP Peter Agius to discuss the challenges EU islands are facing. From isolation and limited resources to reliance on imports and unsustainable transport, their economies often walk a tightrope between development and environmental protection. Now, with the EU Green Deal and Blue Economy initiatives, islands are at a crossroads: economic development and a push towards a greener, more resilient future. However, islands are ready to seize the opportunity presented by the European Commission's consultation on a strategy for islands recently announced by EU Commissioner Fito. An EU strategy for islands would aim to highlight the unique strengths of islands as well as the challenges, calling for a holistic and integrated approach. Mr. Agius, how would you describe the current challenges EU islands face in balancing economic development with sustainability, especially in light of the policies like the Green Deal and ETS?
First of all, thank you, Susanna, for this invitation. When we speak about islands and the Green Deal and economic development, first of all, we are islands, so we are the first to gain from the fight against climate change. Because if there are, for instance, sea level increases, islands are the territories who would have the most dramatic disadvantages with the rising sea levels, right? But as islands, like Malta, for instance, but also all other islands in the EU, we are also very much exposed to international competitiveness because we are not a landlocked country with neighboring countries which you can trade, but we need to open ourselves to the world. And this is the history of Malta, for instance. We have always been open to the world, trading with everyone around us and even far afield. So island competitiveness is more exposed to global factors. And when we speak about climate change and the Green Deal, the European Union in particular, we must take this into account. We cannot fit islands into the same dynamics as continental territories, big cities, big member states. We need to keep in mind that these changes can have a dramatic impact on islands. For instance, when it comes to ETS and ETS Maritime, when it comes to ship transport in particular, Malta is exposed to competitiveness with ports in the north of Africa, which are now taking up parts of the market, which was available to Malta before. But because of the Green Deal rules, there are stakeholders, operators, which are seeing opportunities in investing in Africa to bypass the EU rules when it comes to ETS Maritime. So we need to be careful. We are all stakeholders in our fight against climate change. We all need to advance environmental protection and the fight against climate change. But at the same time, we need to assess very clearly the impact of these rules on the competitiveness of island territories like Malta and others in the Mediterranean especially.
You mentioned ETS. Since January 2024, the EU emissions trading system has been extended to include the shipping sector. You've previously expressed concern that this could place a disproportionate burden on islands. Could you explain why?
By their very nature, islands are highly dependent on international trade and highly exposed to the global dynamics. So ETS Maritime, for instance, put additional burdens on islands like Malta, which are not felt directly by bigger member states or landlocked countries in particular. To give you an example, what's happening with ETS Maritime is there was this fear, and in fact, there was a publication now by the European Commission monitoring the application of ETS Maritime, and this fear was not taken away by this report. And the fear is that for countries to avoid applying the EU rules, which are now taxing shipping companies for international shipments routes, to avoid applying EU rules and paying these taxes, these shipping companies can simply avoid EU ports. Now you have countries like Malta and other countries having free ports, the free port operation, where you have a land in your country which is basically storing container units, and then simply shipping them, ships taking them over and taking them to another territory without them being destined necessarily for EU member states. Now, that kind of free port operation is being impacted by ETS Maritime because free ports in the EU are being put at a disadvantage when compared to free ports in Northern Africa, for instance, and in other states not in the European Union. So to bypass ETS Maritime, shipping companies can easily plan their routes not touching any EU country. And this has an evident competitive disadvantage for EU member states. And what is even worse than that is that the rules which are having the noble motive of addressing climate change and therefore reducing emissions are simply being bypassed. So the intention of the rules, which was to reduce emissions by putting these shipping companies under this regime, is being bypassed simply by these shipping companies going to ports outside the EU. We must address this by having a more efficient system of rules addressing the issue at a global level. So these kind of provisions needs to be put on the table of the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, and being promoted globally rather than imposed on an EU level alone.
You mentioned the ports, and have you seen any real-life examples where island residents are already facing higher prices for goods due to increased shipping costs? Has ETS affected the frequency or reliability of maritime transport services?
When it comes to frequency and reliability, there was this fear that when shipping companies are not using Malta, for instance, because they want to bypass the EU rules and they go to North Africa instead, of course, some of that operation might involve a number of containers intended for local consumption. So the Malta Freeport, for instance, can serve a dual purpose. Okay, it can have, let's say, 90% of its content being simply placed in Malta, intended to be then shipped again in a port outside the European Union, but then it might have 10% which can be intended for local consumption and is then taken away from Freeport and then distributed in the island. So transshipment, which is the operation which normally simply uses a Freeport as a point of transit, okay, can also be helping the local economy by increasing the frequency of transport locally. So that is affecting a bit the frequency if shipping companies are now avoiding Malta altogether. When it comes to prices, of course, the ETS Maritime has already involved a 40% of the whole tariff, which is imposed now on ship transport. The tax is meant to be entered gradually over 3 years, right? 40% this year, 60% over the next 2 years. So the effect on price is still reduced at this stage, but it can already be felt by a number of operators in Malta, not only because of the ETS Maritime, but also in coordination in a phenomenon of different factors collaborating together, including, for instance, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and the fact that right now you have a big problem in the Red Sea with a lot of shipping companies avoiding the Suez Canal altogether. So when you put these three factors together, ETS Maritime, CBAM for some products, especially for construction. Okay, and the Red Sea crisis, this leads to a significant price hike for a lot of products, and especially for freight in particular.
Right, there are a lot of discussions around CBAM as well, concerning other EU member states too. Do you believe the ETS risks undermining territorial continuity, the principle that all regions should remain connected and equally accessible?
Absolutely. I mean, the principle of territorial continuity, which is which is ingrained also in the systems in France and Italy, especially, foresees the helping special assistance to island territories to counteract their disadvantages of them being an island. Okay, so being an island involves direct and indirect burdens, which everyone living in an island will know, but most of them are natural. Even simply the availability of products, the pricing of products, adding the ship transport and all of that. So territorial continuity is a daily challenge, even without ETS. Okay, even without any special burdens, territorial continuity and the disadvantage of islands is already an issue in itself. Now, with ETS and with these additional provisions of the Green Deal, this effect is compounded. And this is why what we are calling for, what we need actually, right, is a more informed approach, a more decision-based, information-based, evidence-based information, which should be inspiring more EU decision-making. This is what I'm calling for here today. And this is what I have called for in the past, and I will insist for in the future, especially in the context of the island strategy for island territories, that we need a more evidence-based approach based on data. So first we should see how a new provision is expected to affect islands, and then we can decide whether islands carry that burden in the same way as any other territory, or maybe in a different way. Because there are the formulas can be found. We have the political goodwill to find the different formulas, a differentiated approach, okay? And we should also heed the call in the treaty itself, okay? The call in the treaty itself is for a cohesion policy, okay, which does not disadvantage particular territories. The call in the treaties is for special attention to islands, because the treaty itself recognizes the particular difficulties of islands. So we should put these together in a more efficient way in this legislature and see that islands are not being asked to carry a burden which is disproportionate to their particular situation.
I see. There are also a few exemptions in the ETS. It includes, for example, for passenger vessels operating between islands with fewer than 200,000 residents and other ports within the same member state. In your view, does this exemption go far enough to support island communities?
You know, I am not happy when I see that we have rules which foresee so many derogations for islands. Instead, I mean, it's good to have this approach of understanding the island's particular needs, but ideally we should devise rules which integrate islands in their own design, right? So the fact that you had, for instance, ETS Maritime for passenger transport requiring tens of derogations from island territories goes to show that the rules are not designed to the needs of islands, or that we have not invested enough for islands to have their passenger transport in line with EU standards. So this is what's happening, for instance, in Malta right now, okay? We have our sister island in the north, which is called Gozo, okay? There is this ferry transport. This ferry transport would qualify for EU funding, in theory, but is still going on with 30-year-old ships, okay? And this requires a derogation from ETS Maritime, okay? So on the one hand, you could say it's good that there is a derogation, but on the other hand, my ambition for my people in Malta and Gozo is to have a cutting-edge transport, state-of-the-art transport, which is ahead of the EU standards and not needing derogations thereto and keeping on the marine pollution nonetheless.
And what kind of measures or adjustments would you propose to ensure EU islands are not unfairly disadvantaged by this policy and can compete on equal footing with mainland regions?
I think the key to everything is more consultation and more involvement at an earlier stage. Unfortunately, I think some of our policy choices are not involving enough islands which do not have enough data on how policies will be affecting them. And this is why I tie this to the call of the EPP, the European People's Party, in our Congress in Bucharest before the European elections, where the European People's Party promised to take more into account the territorial impacts of EU legislation. I think this could be one of the important solutions to ensure that EU legislation is tailored better to the needs of islands by asking the European Commission to involve islands in its impact assessments before proposing legislation. I cannot emphasize enough the need for impact assessments in our proposals for new legislation and revised legislation. And apart from doing the normal aspects of an impact assessment, which involves economic impacts, environmental impacts, societal impacts, these are the three pillars of an impact assessment. I think when it comes to legislation which can have a special impact on islands, especially in transport, okay, they should have a fourth aspect, which includes a specific analysis of the impact of special territories. Because the way that the Commission conducts its impact assessment right now is that it takes a global European approach, right? It takes a European approach. So it can say, listen, how are these new rules meant to impact EU citizens? And in many areas, it's a good way of doing it, right? Because many rules affect all citizens in more or less the same way. But when it comes to rules having a specific impact on islands, especially in transport, okay, we should have a more detailed analysis of the impact of those rules on island territories. And this could at least inform the EU decision-making structures of the special impact on islands before we decide. And like that, of course, we equip the island nations to better present their arguments, to better find alliances around the table, and also to coalesce around a specific objective which unites them because they have the data behind them. The Commission should help in this enterprise. Of course, we cannot, we need also to help ourselves, and this is why I will insist also at a local level when it comes to Malta that we need to have a better understanding, better data for us to present our arguments more efficiently.
You've long advocated for dedicated impact assessments of EU legislation on islands. This was going to be my question as well. And you now call for more data, more action from the European Commission. Could mechanisms like reinvesting ETS revenues locally, say in clean transport or renewable energy, help islands like Malta not just cope, but actually lead in the green transition?
Yes, the reinvestment of proceeds from ETS Maritime to sustainable transport, for instance, is a good idea, right? I will not criticize such a measure because in its essence, it's a good way of, using the proceeds to equip ourselves in a better handling of our climate change needs. But in itself, it does not solve the key issue of having a systemic competitive disadvantage. So let's be very clear. Okay, what we need is rules which do not put islands at a systemic competitive disadvantage when compared to their competitors outside the EU. And this will not be addressed by simply saying, listen, the proceeds will be going to reinvestment in your transport needs. Okay, that is a positive aspect in itself, but it's not enough to justify a rule which puts a systemic competitive disadvantage on islands. So what we need is more intelligent rules from the beginning, and then yes, the proceeds of any income coming from those kind of measures can at least in part be invested in our renewable transport operations.
Finally, looking ahead, what's your vision for how EU policy can better support islands, ensuring they're not just resilient but thriving as models of sustainable development?
Now, apart for the emphasized need for territorial impact assessments when it comes to rules which have a specific impact on islands, then a lot needs to be done by ourselves. You know, politicians, members of the European Parliament, ministers in the Council, commissioners in the European Commission, to coalesce, to find alliances, and pitch our case more effectively and more collectively. So we need to find alliances and build on them. Because in reality, a lot of the situations I would have in Malta when it comes to maritime transport, when it comes to aviation, when it comes to a lot of other issues, would be kind of similar to the issues that, for instance, Cyprus has, the issues that territories like Ireland might have, and other island territories belonging to bigger member states like the Greek islands or the Swedish islands. So we need to work better also at the political level to coalesce our interests, but it starts from having a better understanding of the situation on the ground. And this is why I put a lot of emphasis on the need for the European Commission to provide better data. Also, implementation reports like we have, for instance, for ETS Maritime, which we have on the table now since a couple of weeks. And this will form the basis of an EU alliance for islands, a true EU alliance for islands. And this is, after all, the essence. It will be the starting point for an efficient EU strategy for islands, which we'll be looking forward to discuss in the coming weeks here and in Strasbourg as well.
So the EU Commission should provide data, and then politicians should work towards it. And to avoid disproportionate burden on islands, you call for more action, and you're already working towards it. So thank you very much. And thank you very much also for being here and discussing this important issue with us today.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.